Ombudsman.
Good morning. Welcome to our third session this morning. And it's my pleasure to walk you through and host the session about regulatory sandboxes, a very important one from my perspective, looking back at my experiences working in different banks. And before I do that, I want to introduce you to, I think, the best agenda of the entire week. We have the best topics, the best speakers and panelists of the day. And after the session this morning about RegTech, and we heard about the new GPI, Swift GPI ecosystem with new solution coming up. Now, the next few minutes, we will talk about the learnings and what's next from a regulatory sandbox perspective. Then, something that I also highly recommend is FinTech hubs with the focus on the Americas. I had the pleasure yesterday to join the European discussion. Very interesting information about what's going on in the different regions, how they work together, what are the focus areas, and I expect a lot of good content and information, food for thoughts out of this discussion. Then something that I think for me is a must attend. It's all about cybersecurity. We had a big discussion last year. I was part of that, part of the InnoTribe discussion about cybersecurity and DLT. And we have the Chief Security Officer of Swift attending discussion. So what happened the last 12 months? What's in the pipeline? What are the best practices? How to respond? And I think this is a fascinating discussion that I expect. And at the end, closing session with Kevin Johnson at the end. And I think a fantastic agenda for today. So before I introduce you to the panel, let me talk about the regulatory sandbox topic itself. This is something I have to say. If you see all the innovation, the investments in new technology, in FinTechs and other areas, and for the financial service industry, we're talking about every year $20 billion of investments going into new technologies. And I think this number will even be higher going forward because the startups will get access to even a bigger pool of capital going forward. And we saw in 2016 with the FCA, the regulator in London, approaching that to setting up the first regulatory sandbox program. Besides having a FinTech team, a CTO, that was one of the key measures. And then we saw other regulators also chiming in. And I think looking at that, and I think the key focus or benefits, the purpose of that is definitely to remove uncertainty. And uncertainty is for all the players in the community and ecosystem important to remove that because it attracts capital, it attracts resources, etc., to guide a bank and the FinTech to overcome questions, how to utilize, what are the benefits, what are the limitations in doing this, and then do this in a joint way. Joint way, that meaning the learning curve on both sides are coming up to speed at the same time, instead of doing this in a sequential way, which has an impact on speed and agility. And then with that uncertainty move away, that attracts usually investors. That's because that's something that they hate if there's some uncertainty in the marketplace. And then it's an ongoing learning, adapting. And what we hear also from both panelists is this whole regulatory sandbox is not a static approach. It's a learning and improvement, understanding about the critical success factors. And then based on that, we'll see more and more recommendation, how to utilize certain technology for new products, business models, etc. So I think in that whole new business to embrace disruptive technology, I think it's a must-have, those regulatory sandboxes. And then if you look at then the map of regulatory sandboxes, I think the coverage is global. It's a global topic. From Asia to Europe to North America, there's a lot of activities going on. Plus, there's a lot of interaction between the regulators to address. And it's really my pleasure that we have very good global coverage with our panel today. We have with Bernard Wee from the MIS, the Singapore regulator. And we have Pat Jacobs coming from the OSC, the local Ontario regulator running the Launchpad. So I think it's great to have the perspective from both of them, what's going on in the region, because it's still a local, regional topic, and how this will maybe come together. So having said that, I want to introduce to you to Bernard Wee. He's Executive Director at the MS in Singapore, and will show you the setup of the regulatory sandbox program in Singapore. Please.
Sure. Thanks very much, Oliver. I've got too many things in my hand now. Just a word about me. You might read in my CV that I'm from the FinTech group in the MES. MES has a few different roles. So let me introduce MES a bit. So MES is a central bank. We make monetary policy, and we manage the official foreign reserves of Singapore. That's the first role. Second role is we are an integrated financial regulator. Means we can regulate the banks, insurers, capital markets, everyone from fund management to insurance broking to money broking, securities dealing. The third role that we have is a bit unusual for a central bank. It is like an investment agency. We're responsible for promoting and developing Singapore as an international financial center. And that's where the FinTech function sits, and that's where I sit. And but I haven't been in this role all my life. I've spent 6 years managing the FX policy in MES, so I do have some background in capital markets and financial markets. And if you read my CV, the most important thing you need to know is that I have 2 corgis. If you ever think about getting a dog, corgis are big dog personalities in a small dog frame. So anyway, that's an interesting fact about me. So I was asked to talk about innovation sandboxes. You can't get away from a sandbox without talking about FinTech. Because the only reason why you have a sandbox is because you have FinTech companies. And to us, a smart financial center is no different from a regular financial center. What does that mean? It means that you have to go back to being a purposeful financial center. What is a purposeful financial center? You have to help people achieve their dreams, what they're trying to save for college, save for retirement, borrow to buy that tractor, buy the vehicle to make deliveries. That's what a financial center does. A financial center helps people to protect their sources of growth, protect the house that they've bought, that they've saved for from floods, from earthquakes, protect the factory. That's what a regular financial center does. That's what a smart financial center has to do. Going back to basics, helping people to improve people's lives, manage risks better, improve efficiency. It's no different just because it's FinTech. So that's the way we think about FinTech. That's the way we think about financial services. That's the way we think about Singapore serving the region and the world. Sandboxes. Now, to us, a sandbox fits into a regulator, a policymaker's toolkit. This is the life cycle of a startup. I think you can break it up into 4 main phases. The first and the top 2, encourage as many ideas to be created as possible. And you do that through hackathons, through accelerators, to bring up as much of the ideation at the start of the process, at the start of the life cycle. In the second phase, you want to help FinTech companies to go up the learning curve as quickly as possible. So you encourage them to experiment with FIs, experiment with the public sector, and co-create with industry, because you want to align FinTech companies, you want to align their intention, align their technology with what society wants, with what FIs are trying to do, with what government is trying to do, with what society is trying to achieve for itself. That's the purpose of the second phase. The third, graduated regulations, to right-size regulations for the risks that companies pose, for the risks that fintechs pose, for the types of financial activities that fintechs take, because fintech companies aren't necessarily about being universal, being straight through, being all one stop, but rather being very focused, very targeted at what services they want to provide. So right-sizing regulations is an important third part. And finally, recognition. Recognizing successful businesses, recognizing successful fintech companies, recognizing successful business models so that you create a virtuous cycle. You set a good example for more people to create more new ideas, more new business models. And that's the life cycle of fintech. It's the same life cycle that we have for any type of technology. So where does the regulatory sandbox fit? It fits in between getting companies to develop business models, to develop ideas, and between success, because you need to create a space for companies to experiment, to find out if they're going to succeed, to find out if they're not going to succeed. That's where we see the sandbox. The most important question about why we have sandbox is the two questions that fintech companies come to MAS. The first is, what financial activity am I doing? Am I a securities dealer? Am I a financial advisor? Am I a money broker? Am I a money changer? Is there a difference? What regulations apply to me? Because very often they come and tell us, I can't navigate your website. Your website is organized according to the activities you've already decided. Your rules are written by lawyers for lawyers to read, and lawyers are expensive, and I'm just a fintech company. Tell me how I fit into your regulatory framework. And then we spend a lot of time. We sit down with them, understand their business model, to explain to them these are the requirements. Your business model looks like this. I think these requirements apply to you. Then you get to part two of the problem. I can't meet your requirements, because the two things that fintech companies do not have are money and time. And this affects their ability to pay down capital requirements or liquidity requirements, fees, or they don't have time. What does don't have time mean? They may not have a board that has track record. They may not have a CEO that has spent enough time in the industry. It's important to explain to fintech companies why we require certain things, why we require working capital cover 6 months of operating expenses. But usually these are the two or three, well, actually it's two big areas that fintech companies come to us for. I don't understand the rules, you tell me the rules and I can't meet them. And that leads us to the nature of the sandbox. I think let me just focus on a couple of areas. One is the when. To us, a sandbox needs to be open all year round to everyone. We know that some regulators have a sandbox qualification period. It's like a beauty parade. You can apply to be part of the sandbox. I would choose maybe 10, 20 people to enter the sandbox for a period of 6 months. To us, that's great, but you're not competing against others. To us, every business competes against itself. And you never know when you're going to have a good idea, whether it's in March, May, or September, that you're going to have a good business proposal. So for us, it was very important from the start, to be always open for application. And the last part I wanted to focus on is experiments within boundaries. I think we have to make clear, whether it's to the fintech company, but most importantly, to consumers, where the boundaries are. So for us, the sandbox, people who are in our sandbox are listed on our website. We make clear to consumers that you are dealing with an entity that is lightly regulated, has been given a number of exemptions. You may not even be eligible for dispute resolution that we have set up for regular financial services. It is as much as it's important to empower the fintech companies, it is also important to empower consumers to make their own decisions about the risks that they want to take. My last slide is on the sandbox process. So there are 3 phases to the sandbox process. The first is the application stage. I say there are 3, but actually there are 3 plus 1. Before you get to the application stage, there's a lot of consultation with the fintech company. So it's a pre-application stage. Tell us about what you want to do before you submit the form, before you submit your application, because we don't want you to spend a lot of time writing up an application that is incorrect, that is incomplete, that is not going to help you. So have a conversation with us in the pre-application phase. But we do commit that once you submit a formal application, we will aim to give an indication of whether it's suitable for the sandbox within 21 working days. And that's the application process. Then after we give an indication that it is suitable, we work with the company in the evaluation stage, back and forth, to understand exactly what dispensations it needs, what exemptions it requires, and what we can give and what we can't. And at this point, it's also important for us to work with the company to draw red lines, because there are things that every financial service needs to offer its customers. Number 1, customer confidentiality. They need to treat the customers seriously. They need to treat the customers with privacy. Number 2, fit and proper. Being fintech doesn't make anyone exempt from fit and proper requirements. The third, AML. Also very important, because once you get your foot wrong on ML and TF issues, it's very hard to get back on again, and that's important to all of us. So that's the evaluation stage. Then we get into experimentation, and then we set clear timelines, how long the experiment is meant to last, and when you need to let us know if you need to extend the experiment. Sandbox is not a quick sandbox. You're not meant to be stuck in there forever. So the idea is really to get out of the sandbox into the mainstream. And that's what I want to share. So thank you, everyone.
Good. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. It's an interesting aspect how you run the sandbox and how the evolution on your side. And want to invite Pat to come on stage and to walk us through what's the setup at Launchpad as the chief of the Launchpad initiative of the OSC.
Thanks, Oliver. Great. Okay, so I'm Pat Chacos. I lead the OSC Launchpad initiative at the Ontario Securities Commission. We're set up a little differently than MAS. We are the Securities and Investment Industry Regulator. So in Canada, that is kind of under provincial authority, so we work with our other securities regulators across the country, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So just a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to try and cover today. So in terms of our overall purpose, we actually had been working with a number of novel business models. My background is actually in the exempt market, so you tend to see a lot of people thinking about how do you automate trading platforms? How can I get capital raising for startups? So we had started to see a number of businesses in that space for about 2 years prior to starting Launchpad. And what we were really recognizing is we really needed to modernize regulation. Regulation was really built at a time where things were face-to-face, across the table, paper-based, and things were really evolving. So number 1, we're really looking to modernize regulation to support fintech innovation, but at the same time want to make sure that we're protecting investors. So 3 main focuses. Number 1, engage with the fintech community. Similar to what you heard from Bernard, we have found that many of the businesses coming in may have the technologists on staff, but may not understand they're actually in a regulated space. But it's a two-way relationship. We as regulators need to change. We need to understand what's out there, what's working, what's not. So it's very important that we're engaging with the fintech community. Number 2, we're offering support to the fintech businesses. So You get to come in, talk to us, find out kind of what are some of the things you need to be thinking about, and we want to make sure we're talking to firms very early on, because that's when they're building their platform. If we're talking to them, once they've built a platform, it becomes too expensive, too costly, and they don't want to hear that, all at that stage that, oh, they're in a regulated space and some of the things that they could have automated were not. And then finally, we want to take our learnings and we want to make sure that we're changing our policies, our rules, and that we're applying it to similar businesses, because this is not just for fintech startups, this is for novel business ideas, and that can apply to large, FIs, incumbent firms, and startups equally. So we started this initiative last year around this time. It was a pilot. And I'm actually pleased to announce that Launchpad is going to be permanent. So that really is a reflection of our commitment to innovation over the long term. So really excited about that. And we'll talk a little bit of kind of what we've seen in the past year and why we think this is important. Our initiative is similar to MAS, FCA, and ASIC. They tend to use the terminology, or at least ASIC and the FCA, talk about Innovation Hub and Sandbox. We've actually tried to put both into this initiative because, number one, Innovation Hub is really the direct support to the fintech community and engagement with the fintech community. But what we're finding is people do need relief. They come in, you can talk to them about what the regulatory requirements are, but if there's a barrier, they're saying, I can't do that. So we needed the ability to provide some type of relief. We're set up, I'll call it hub and spoke. I know that's not kind of a fintech term, but we've got a small core team, and then we've got dedicated staff within each of the branches. Because if you're coming into us and you're talking about a digital platform, we've got to make sure we've got our market reg staff and people involved. Because this is change. This is change for the regulator as well, and we need to be able to obviously have everybody involved as part of that. These are some of the events that we've had over the past year, anywhere from OSC Dialogue, which is our big annual event focused on fintech last year and embracing change this year. I'm going to talk a little bit about we had our own hackathon very early on, a lot of learnings coming out of that. We've got a great video and white paper if you're interested. Information days, really an opportunity to come in and talk to us, ask any kind of questions even before you're even thinking about a business and how we can help. Obviously meetups, industry conferences like the one today. In terms of requests for support, we're finding businesses at various stages, some that are ready to be licensed or registered, and some very early on and just thinking about an idea. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the CSA regulatory sandbox in a bit. In Canada, as I said, we have although Ontario is home to 80% of the capital markets, we work with our provincial regulators because investors are across Canada. We're obviously a large company in terms of geographic region. So we want to make sure that any business that's coming into us or coming into BC or any of the provinces is able to operate across Canada. And then finally, this is an interesting topic. It's an interesting topic for everyone because these businesses, especially some of the larger players, they're looking to operate globally. So you heard earlier this morning people talking about data standards, even standards in terms of regulation and how do you apply, because especially the global firms need to be able to operate worldwide. So in terms of businesses that we've seen, obviously in terms of trends, we had already started to see peer-to-peer lending. Obviously that's important in terms of alternative lending sources. Venture capital investing platforms, and I think that's important because obviously startups, new businesses are really looking to raise capital, and how do you do that if you're not able to get in the door of a large venture cap firm? And I'll give an example of that. AngelList, which is obviously a global platform, is now here in Canada, and we were part of that. Initial coin offerings, obviously the new way to capital raise, everyone's talking about it. Whether it's distribution token events, but at the end of the day, fundamentally, it's really capital raising for these businesses. And then obviously investment funds are thinking about investing in the cryptocurrencies and these new coins and tokens. I talked a bit about the regulatory sandbox, so that means you come in to the OSC, but we will work with our counterparts to make sure you operate across Canada. We also have cooperation agreements with a number of global regulators and working on a few more that'll be coming soon. Currently we've got UK, ASIC, and a few more in the pipes. Our FinTech Advisory Committee is a very important part for us because we recognize we don't know what we don't know. And so what we did is we have a FinTech Advisory Committee made up of business people that are in this space, whether they're the venture cap firms that are looking at these businesses or the ones that are building the blockchain technologies or ones that are thinking about kind of online advising and some of the other new developments, whether it's artificial intelligence or otherwise. And then recently we also, similar to a number of jurisdictions that you've seen with all the interest around cryptocurrency offerings, we've put out a notice on that front as well. In terms of emerging trends, I talked a little bit about some of the trends we had already seen. We're really seeing a lot around RegTech, data analytics being used in various ways. And when I say RegTech to me is you could have a firm focused on RegTech, but you could have a business idea that solves for the regulatory requirements and legal requirements. And I think that's an important thing because obviously people are thinking about driving business, but if at the same time you're able to expedite and make other processes more efficient, I think that's a good thing. White labeling, I think that will become more important because technology is expensive. People like to brand, obviously, with their names. So we're seeing a lot of white labeling of portfolio management. And then we've already talked about kind of some of the things we're seeing on crypto. So our RegHack-TO, we were the first Canadian regulator to actually have a hackathon, weekend-long hackathon supported by our executive. And we actually had our Minister of Finance also attend. It was first of its kind, over 130 attendees, and then obviously 40 OSC volunteers. And as I said, for me personally, that was important because this has changed for us even as an organization. We had problem statements in RegTech, know your client and identity verification. For me, that's a huge area. We've actually, in our white paper, put out a challenge to people in terms of if you're thinking about this kind of business, come in and talk to us because you don't want to have to be every single time you go for a mortgage or a loan or a bank account or your securities dealer account filling out similar information. How can we make that a better process for everyone? And then finally, transparency in areas that we don't typically have transparency. Think about OTC markets, exempt markets. If we can improve transparency in some of those areas, I think that would be a great thing for all of us, Canada and globally. If you're interested, our videos at reghackto.ca. And with that, I am going to turn it back to Oliver.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Pat. And Miranda, I think I want to invite you to come to the family table and want to ask you a few questions. So it's great to see you both that establishing this over the last 12, 18 months, an important part of your toolbox, both as you outline to overcome uncertainty. If you look at the expectation going into this program, so what are the key learnings and challenges that you faced over especially the last 12 months, Pat? What do you, maybe one or two?
I think, from a regulatory perspective, from my perspective, there's a lot of interest in this. There are a lot of businesses coming in to talk to us. And I think it's like anything else. When you're not used to thinking about regulatory requirements, you're really thinking about how do I do the most consumer-friendly platform? Because that's what's driving this, right? Consumers want 24/7 service. They want to do everything over their phone or an app. They don't want to have to necessarily go into a branch or office kind of during business hours. So I think there's a lot of interest. So from a personal perspective, just managing expectations, I think, is a huge one for us. From an operational point of view, I think I actually, I hear a lot about kind of open data and data standards, and I think that's something we all need to be talking about, not just the regulators, but industry as well, and how do we make that happen. I think the ecosystem and how we build that ecosystem is a challenge.
And how do you manage the whole workload? I can imagine that there's so much going on in the community from a banking perspective and then also from a startup fintech perspective. Give us an indication of how much volume is, of how many people are knocking at your door every day, and how you manage that. Because I can imagine that it can be huge, no?
It's quite a bit. So we do something similar to what the MAIS does. We actually have a request for direct support form. And so one of the things we're really looking for is, are you eligible? Are you novel? Are you doing something different? And how are you disrupting, let's say, financial services? So we go through that. But even with that, we have a lot of interest. As I said, Ontario obviously has many of the capital markets participants here. And I think, listen, now that we're permanent, I think there's going to be a resource ask at some point. But the good thing is we've got great teams, and we're able to draw on all the different branches at the OSC. So I think still to be determined. As I said, we were a pilot project, but something we're obviously going to have to think a little bit more about long term now.
Bernard, in talking to the MS team over the last few months, I saw a change from compared to the starting point 12, 18 months ago and now. So maybe if you can share the key learnings on your side, because I think the approach is much more narrow than at the beginning, no?
Sure. I think we face the same challenge. We're a small organization. Actually, in the FinTech function, there are only about 20 of us. With 20 people, you can't handle 700 Sandbox applications. I mean, you can't have that many. And I think, it's always a tension, right? You want to be helpful to people who come to you, but you also want them, you don't want to be so over-helpful that it becomes a big resource issue, because then you have to create expectations in the second, third, and the fifth and 50th applicant about how much time you can spend with them interpreting your own regulations for them. So that's a tension. That's something we have to manage. Self-help is useful. So one thing that we've helped the industry to do is set up a FinTech association, because then, with the FinTech association, you also are able to link up with people like lawyers who are willing to provide pro bono advice at the very early stages just to get the name out there. So that's part of what we do to help to manage our own workload. The other thing that we also do is to prioritize. I think we recognized very early on that some use cases will become quite mainstream. Crowdfunding is one. 2 years ago, we saw the writing on the wall. You see crowdfunding blooming in the US, blooming in the UK. So what do? I talked about mainstreaming earlier, because for financial services, FinTech, the idea is to get them out of the sandbox, get them into the mainstream. If you know that a particular business model is going to become mainstream, then do it early. And what we did was to write rules for crowdfunding very early on, get them out there, and these were able to apply for regular licenses to be securities market service providers. Then you don't have to spend a lot of time with them in the sandbox. They also don't want to be in the sandbox, because as a regular license holder, they also have the cover, they also have the confidence that they can tell the customers, we are fully regulated like a regular financial institution to provide the service.
Interesting. In talking to your MAS CTO, he said to me, Oliver, we are very keen on something that on paper we should not approve. And we want to have that in our test environment, Sandbox environment, and even we want to allow in our production environment to a phased go live, that we are part of something that maybe at the beginning is not eligible to get approved. Is that something that you see also coming through more and more?
I think that there are different models of helping companies with different business models. Whether you think it'll be approved or not approved for different reasons. The sandbox is one. The other is a project that we're doing regionally. It's called the Asian Financial Inclusion Network, where we work with service technology providers to provide different types of banking services as service, so that you can experiment with tier 2, tier 3 banks who are looking to offer additional services. It's about making clear, and we did this in the Sandbox guidelines, what is up for negotiation and what is not.
What's not, okay.
Yeah, so I touched on it earlier as well. What is not up for negotiation is you have to be fit and proper, you have to guard customer confidentiality, MLTF. Everything else.
Because he mentioned to me in June, July that 1 or 2 companies are going into production as part of the MIS production environment or Sandbox environment. And that's something that I never heard before, that a startup is utilizing the regulatory environment to go into production and to learn from that. That's something that I found fascinating.
So we had one graduate from our Sandbox. She's called Policy Pal. So I can share a little bit about what the business was supposed to be. So many of us have different types of insurance coverage, whether it's medical insurance, life insurance, health insurance, home insurance. But a lot of these policies are printed on paper. So the first thing that Policy Pal did, it was to read paper policies, ingest them, and then present them in a digital dashboard to show, to help you understand what your own coverage is. And this started off because the founder herself, she had a mom who was very ill many years ago. And when her mom was in hospital, she was trying to figure out exactly what coverage her mom had to pay for hospital expenses. And she couldn't figure it out. And so she thought that she wasn't the only one facing this challenge, and she would help all other Singaporeans to solve that problem by piecing together what coverage they have. So she does this. And by piecing together what coverage you have, you can also identify what gaps, what you are not covered for. And that's where the business model comes in, because then you can work with existing insurers to fill in those gaps. And that's where Policy Pal is. Today, they graduated in 1st of September, and they've got 5 insurance companies working with them.
Wow. Okay, it's interesting. Good to hear. A hot topic that you already mentioned, Pat, in your presentation is the whole coming out of now distributed ledger, decentralized business model, now cryptocurrencies, and initial coin offering. That's a hot topic
globally.
Globally, it's a global topic because I see this because I'm running this Crypto Valley Association, and I see that startups that have been constrained to get access to capital because the VCs, you have to find the right VC, you have to convince them, and you have to do this every year to raise capital, and it takes 50% and more time of an executive on the startup side to organize the fundraising. And then you have a discussion about how much influence you want to give the VCs, share classes, etc. And now we see that the distributed ledger technology has been used to issue tokens to get funding, or as a utility, different kinds of tokens out there. And we see that companies are getting access to 30, 50 million in a global access to a global capital pool. What's your experiences, how this will play out? Because at the end, I believe that I think the right balance between innovation and regulation is necessary. There has to be regulation from my perspective because it's investor protection here. But based on your experience and observation in the Canadian market, could you share where this will play out? Is it something that you would see in Canada, there will be a shutdown, or you think there is more a balance between black and white?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly didn't go the shutdown route. I know there's been a couple of countries that obviously have, China and Korea. I think our approach is similar to what you've heard coming out of the SEC, Singapore, Japan, a number of other jurisdictions, FCA also in Australia. And what we've said is, you can call it a currency, you can call it a token, but at the end of the day, it's a security. And we need to ensure that there's investor protection. Come in and talk to us. We realize that you're going to need some relief in terms of regulatory frameworks. We want to help support this. But one of the things that we won't give up on is just ensuring that investors are protected. So, are you doing kind of the basic AML and KYC for investors? Do they understand what they're buying? Because I think it's like anything else. I think the blockchain technology has huge opportunities in financial services. I mean, obviously in terms of back office, middle office, and some of the bigger kind of trading functions, but it also has opportunities for market participants, right? But how do we do it in a way that investors know what they're buying, know what they can expect, and at the same time they say, yes, that's something I'm willing to invest in. I didn't have an opportunity to invest in these offerings in the past. I do now. And they really, want to be able to do that. But I think it is fraught with certain issues, and I think, obviously valuation. How do those tokens get valued is one of them from an investor protection point of view. But as I said, I mean, I think the blockchain technology allows kind of immediate settlement. I know there's obviously scalability type issues, but there are many, many benefits, I think, that we'll see coming out of that.
So what do you think, it will mature over time with clear guidance from the regulator?
Yes.
Because I think the benefits to tap into a global pool, and then also the efficiency, and I think there are a lot of benefits, but I think on the other side, as you said, KYC, AML, the regulation already in place should be respected and be followed. No?
Yeah, I mean, take something like crowdfunding. I think, we've all got crowdfunding regulation, but still, it's like, there are, do you go to accredited investors? How do you find them? How do you find the VC firms? So there are opportunities to create platforms or websites, and how do you do it? But do it in a way that really, I like the phrase that Diana used this morning. She said, rather than avoid regulation, embrace it, but realize that we're open and flexible. We're not asking everyone to do it the old-fashioned way. We're actually recognizing that we need to support the innovation. But just make sure you've got the protection, whether it's the client onboarding. We've seen great ideas in terms of client onboarding for investors. And they're able to look at social media and other data that actually helps the portfolio manager or the advisor know who their client is. So I think those are all great opportunities.
Okay. Good. I think we have still 5 minutes left. I think I want to ask the audience for any questions that you have. I think we have the first one in the front. That's quick.
I have a question related to FinTech Bridge or FinTech Pact, because I realize both OSC and MES are the early ones who did it, and I realize it's making a global impact now to the rest of the world. But I'd like to know, what are the actual positive outcome you have seen from the fact that the regulators are collaborating, or if you have not seen it yet, what do you expect in the future?
It's a good question, because there's a lot of memorandum of understanding or bridges between on the Canadian side, on the Singapore side. Bernard, you want to start? What kind of benefits? Because I think Singapore has a lot of bridges in place over the last 12 months, and I think also Ontario. So, beside first handshake, do you see already benefits coming through, as you asked?
Sure. So ostensibly the main benefit is to create a green lane for companies which have already operating in one market, whether it's in Singapore, to gain access into another market, to have a green lane into the regulators' conversation, because every regulator is bogged down with many applications. Having that green lane matters. But more importantly, it creates a channel between regulators to exchange views on what they're seeing in each of their markets, because different markets are seeing different explosions of activity in different areas, whether it's ICOs, whether it's crowdfunding, or whether it's in insurance. Singapore is a big insurtech market, and other regulators will be keen to understand what the latest developments are in specific areas that they're not seeing. So I think that's the bigger benefit we're seeing with that.
I mean, we've had the benefit of actually part of the cooperation agreements is not only for businesses to be able to go, as we said, from Canada to, let's say, Singapore or Australia, but the other way around. So I think it's a two-way. But the other thing I think is actually our calls that we're actually sharing trends. I think actually, my experience has been a lot of the trends are very consistent. And the challenges are consistent. So I think it's important that we're talking about it, hearing from the different industry perspectives too. I've been lucky enough to be at a number of industry conferences globally, and I'm hearing very consistent themes. So that's why, at least I can stand up with confidence and say what we're hearing here is very similar to what we're hearing globally. So I do think, obviously, they're of great benefit, the cooperation agreements, but also, even before that, I think the relationships were good and we were able to have those discussions.
Good. I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, Abraham Tashian, StanChart Singapore. Bernard, this is a question for you. Since its inception, you've only admitted 2 startups to the Sandbox. Now, does this speak to the severity of the application process, or more that the regulator is engaged enough to tell startups that, look, you don't need to go into the Sandbox, you're good enough as it is, and you fit into the existing regulatory regime? Just your thoughts on that.
Yep. All right. Sooner or later, somebody's going to ask me about that. It's about mainstreaming. I think that's the word I used earlier. That's the word we keep coming back to, because FinTech is not an offshoot of financial services. It is not a temporary phenomenon. At the end of the day, FinTech is financial service. It's just providing it with either a different business model, using technology, being technology enabled. Mainstreaming requires the regulator to look at what the trends are and put together a framework for what we think is going to be mainstream. I talk about crowdfunding as one of them. Robo-advisory will be the next one. And that's why we also consulted on robo-advisory guidelines. Once you are able to take out the main use cases out of the Sandbox, you are left with a few. PolicyPal is an innovative one, and you can focus your attention, focus all your resources on the ones which are truly unique, which are different, and deserving of regulatory attention.
So the best use of the resources and timing perspective, no?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, can I just add something to that? Just from our experience, I find the first ones are always the toughest, right? Because it's not any different than our first cryptocurrency fund or coin offering or online advisor. I think those tend to take more time, but once you've established kind of what are the concerns and how do you move forward, it will be a lot easier for kind of future businesses. So that's been our experience, and I think even in that case, it was still a lot faster than going through to the various channels. So good news overall.
So from SEC, out of the discussion, I think working with the regulator, now I think I saw a big change on the regulation. Again, I've been with US for many, many years and in normal control meetings and been discussed, and see this is part of a toolbox going forward that I want to encourage everybody to leverage this as much as possible, no? Because it's a win-win for all of them, from a FinTech bank regulator perspective to come up to speed to tackle those issues, because it's a more and more fast-moving environment, because there is so much investments going in new disruptive technology and embracing that. At the end, it's also removing the uncertainty, because that has from a business development perspective for a location like Ontario or for Singapore, an important will influence the position and the growth of that location, and that only can will happen in working together. From that perspective, is something that I really enjoyed over the last few years in working with the regulator, because that's a fantastic opportunity to drive new services that maybe we couldn't see before. So give Pat and Bernard a big round of applause. I think that was a fantastic presentation, insights, and thank you so much. Before we finish the session, I want to give you a few updates, information. What's next at 12:45? Lisa will be there with the representative of the FinTech hubs in the Americas, North and South America. I think fascinating discussion. And as always, at the end of our sessions, we want to mobilize you. The best coffee, as always, you find it here at the Inner Tribe coffee shop. And drink a coffee and donate $1 and $2 for the Save the Children Foundation. I think it's very important to help the children in Mexico after two big or major earthquakes in September. So thank you so much for your attention, and see you later.